recording now, but anyway, I can edit out any of the talk before.
Cool.
But let me go ahead and start now. I am joined today, and I'm thrilled to be joined by my dear brother, incredible apologist, incredible, brilliant mind, my friend, my dear friend, Pat Flynn. We're going to be talking about atheism, a topic that I love to talk about, atheism, Christianity, of course, and everything just related to the topic of theism in general. And of course, when we talk about theism, we talk about objections to the belief in God. And I can't think of anyone better to deal with those than my brother, Pat Flynn, who's Pat, you've dealt with a lot of these head on, haven't you?
Well, first off, thank you, William. Very flattering introduction. So really happy to be here. It's great to talk with you as always. And in fact, yes, I have. I mean, I used to be something of an atheist myself. So I swam in the worldview of naturalism for a very long time. I've obviously since rejected it. But I think what I have rejected is a mature version of it. I don't think I've rejected any cartoons. I think I understand what the naturalistic project is about. I think I really understand what sorts of objections on a deep philosophical level are thrown at the existence of God. Of course, there's always those popular level cartoons out there, right? And we can talk about some of those if you want. They don't really interest me too terribly much. And yeah, I mean, at this point, most of the work I do philosophically concerns worldview comparison. It's in philosophy of religion. So for me, I'm a classical theist, so I think classical theism is the sort of best worldview. Worldview, for people who might not be familiar with that terminology, is a sort of a big picture of reality. That's what worldview is, right? So I'm very interested in that type of philosophical work. It's philosophy of religion. I've got 2 books really in this sort of realm right now. One I just shipped off to Catholic Answers. That's on Aquinas's De Ente, his Aquinas's little known way to God. And then the other one I'm doing with Sophia is actually called The Best Argument for God, which starts by looking at what I think are some of the best arguments against God and trying to do a little philosophical judo and reverse them type of thing, Now,
let me ask you this. Is there anything currently available for the audience to purchase of a book of yours right now, or not yet?
On neither of these books do I believe there is a pre-order option, but
gotcha.
Yeah,
okay.
So sorry.
But God willing, there will be soon. And I what I really liked, the point that you made was when dealing with atheism, you don't tackle any kind of caricatures, which is a good point because you hear that from their side a lot. They will complain and say, well, look, when theists deal with our best arguments, they simply make a caricature of what we truly believe. So you're saying you rejected what I would probably call the best that atheism has to offer, and you chose theism over atheism. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Certainly before I reject something, especially something so fundamental as a worldview, I want to make sure I sort of understand it, right? I think that's a good working policy. And I think that works both ways, right? Before somebody totally renounces the idea of God, have you really studied it? Have you studied the different theistic schools and the different theistic traditions? I meet many atheists. Same thing with Christianity, right? You have many people who are sort of brought up. I encounter a lot of people who are atheists who are brought up in a sort of fundamentalist Protestant background, and they reject that. And I would say a lot of the reasons that they reject that aren't bad reasons. I probably would have rejected it myself. But then they never take another look at Christianity again. And I try to invite these people to do so and say, hey, look, I get why you rejected that. There's a lot of stuff in your background that I think is unreasonable, but that isn't Christianity as a whole. And of course, I want to say the same thing about belief in God. What people reject tends to be a lot of cartoonish ideas of God, not very philosophically serious. But to be fair, it can go the other way. Sometimes people who reject atheism or never really try to understand an atheistic worldview are prone to making cartoons of it as well. So I'm doing the best I can to try and elevate the discourse. Don't get me wrong, I think atheism is totally false and absurd at the end of the day still.
No doubt.
But there are more philosophically serious articulations of it than others. Yeah.
Those are very good points there. And I think I'm reminded of a dialogue that I had with a prominent atheist debater and author. His name is John Loftus. He's a friend of mine. This was not even, I think maybe a month ago, Pat, and we were talking, and I brought up one point to him, and he agreed on the air. The point that I brought up was, I said, look, when you atheists come to the table and you attack Christianity, a lot of the times you're attacking a fundamentalist Protestant kind of view of Christianity, and you need to look at things from a different perspective, because when dialoguing with any of these apostolic Christians from apostolic churches, the arguments are very different. We are able to utilize early church fathers without having any worries of it blowing up in our face. And I brought up the fact that we can look at early church history, we can look at early church councils, and John, who was a very strong atheist, admitted, he said, it is much different when we dialogue with a Catholic, if you will, Catholic, or he didn't bring up Orthodox, but he alluded to anyone that is part of an apostolic faith. And I think that goes to the heart of what you were bringing out there, Pat. I think that a lot of the times the version of Christianity that does get attacked is I don't want to be rude to our Protestant brothers or our friends and within Protestantism or separated brothers and sisters, but it's a bit of a flimsy kind of position that is quite at times easy to knock over, and they do attack that, don't they?
Yeah, they certainly do. And I also want to go further and say there tends to also be a conflation between Christianity and theism. And clearly Christians are theists, but not all theists are Christians. I mean, before I became Catholic, I was attracted to a very sort of broad theistic religious pluralism. I thought that had a lot of philosophical steam to it. Ultimately, I became convinced of the Catholic worldview. But even if you rejected Christianity, that doesn't mean you should just automatically become an atheist, right? Because I would argue there's many great reasons to be a theist, independent of being a Christian. Now, if you think that there's good reasons, say, for monotheism in particular, and even going deeper into philosophy of God, say, a very traditional conception of God, one with like a full strength divine simplicity, that starts narrowing down the sort of list of possibly true religions. In fact, I think it knocks a bunch of Protestantism out. Not all Protestantism, but a fair amount of it, right? The theistic personalists and whatnot. And that's sort of what happened to me, So what I'm trying to detail here is I became a theist and an increasingly refined theist before I became a Catholic, but it was because I sort of was doing the background philosophy of God that I became interested in Catholicism, because it seemed like they were kind of getting a lot of things right about a lot of things: philosophy of God, natural law, moral reasoning. And when you it's hard to ignore that. And then you can evaluate the other claims from there. So it's just important. The philosophers are sometimes annoying because, they're all about making distinctions, but if you don't make distinctions, then you'll become confused, and and so it's worth being patient over this and trying to gain conceptual clarity before just launching into a debate.
Pat, when I had first became Catholic many moons ago now, it took me a while before I began to delve into dealing with atheism and what have you, because I flirted with it when I lost my Protestant faith. It was a bit of a shocker. If Reformed Protestantism is not true, then it was just a shocker to my system. So it took a while. But the one thing that I told myself, and I know you probably think the same thing, I said, look, if I'm going to be an apologist or be in this field, I better get acquainted with the very best arguments atheism has to offer. Why be afraid of them if you are convinced that that Catholicism or Christianity in general is true? Then why be afraid of what the very best arguments they have to offer? And I began digging into, okay, well, what do they have to offer? Began reading, I don't mean pop atheist apologetics. I began reading what people consider to be their top scholars in the field. And with that being said, one particular area that I love to delve into, perhaps we can talk about it later, is the bodily resurrection of Christ. I'd like to ask you, and by the way, for the audience to know, I don't think they have any good arguments attacking the bodily resurrection. I'm merely talking about the fact that I did challenge myself, and my faith came out even stronger. And even today, my belief in God, my belief in the Catholic faith, thank the good Lord, and my belief and love for the faith is on fire. And I want to ask you, before we even delve into anything on the positive aspect, what do you think is the hardest hitting argument against theism?
Yeah, so I think there's let's put it into three different categories. I actually think Aquinas was kind of on point Because in his Summa, right at the beginning, he considers arguments against God, but he only considers two, which is unusual for Aquinas because he's known for listing just an enormous host of objections and systematically going through them. But curiously, very curiously, when he comes to God's existence, he only lists two. And the two that he lists are the problem of evil, perennial objection, right? How can God exist alongside what appears to be his absolute contrary, essentially, right? And we can go into that. I hope we do here in this conversation. But there's another argument, and it's not talked about as much, but it is still a very prominent argument among philosophical naturalists. And it's something like this. Aquinas doesn't phrase it this way, but in the modern conversation, it is phrased this way. It would say something like this, William. It would say, if two theories explain just as much, believe the simpler. Atheism and theism explain just as much. Atheism is simpler, therefore believe atheism. Now, Aquinas essentially just says, are the principles of nature a sufficient, adequate explanation? If so, then we don't really need God. Of course, he ultimately rejects that. But it's actually that second argument that I actually find more philosophically interesting. Don't get me wrong, the problem of evil is very philosophically interesting, but the book I'm currently writing is actually more concerned with that second argument. And you notice that isn't an argument directly against the existence of God. So the problem of evil, sort of is. It's either meant to show that there is a logical incompatibility there, or that there's just strong evidential weight to really think God does not exist. The other argument just shows that God seems to be an unnecessary explanatory postulate. So let's just do away with it. It doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. It's just saying, look, this isn't really doing any theoretical work here, so why bother? So it's important to understand it's a different type of objection. Now, I said there were three categories, and the third category would be sort of, I guess, the problem evil would fall under it. It's really coherence objections against theism, where it's taking our sort of understanding of God, and critics will try and tease out some type of incoherence or contradiction or something like that. That's another class of arguments, and problem evil is an example of that. So I know I didn't answer your question with just one. I gave you, two out there, but I think those are the strongest paths that a skeptic could take. Right.
Those are very good, Pat. Let me try and throw a little bit of a curveball at you, because you bring up a really good point there when it comes to the problem of evil. I remember, and I'm going to bring up, I don't remember, he's a doctor. Let's just say Dan Barker. I'm going to bring up Dan Barker, with whom I've debated multiple times, and Dr. Price, when they repeated the exact point you brought up. And I want to ask you, how do you think the best way to deal with it would be? They bring up the point, they'll say, okay, well, William, this is what Dan Barker told me the last time we debated. Said, William, even if I grant you there is a God, you've got a major problem with evil, because the God that you Christians worship is a tyrannical, evil God. So you bring up a great point. The problem of evil doesn't in and of itself disprove God. And you have atheists nowadays, some of them saying, okay, well, what if we say that there is a God? If we do, it's a bigger problem for these Christians, because it's not a loving God. It's a tyrannical, evil God because of this very problem of evil. How would we? What do you think would be the best way to tackle that?
Yeah. Let's
You've heard that,
some time on it. Yeah, of course I've heard it. It's a common enough assertion, and it's rhetorically loaded as well, right? But yeah, let's take it apart, and we'll look at the it's really problems of evil, right? There's not just one. Traditionally, you have these very strong form problems of evil, call them the logical problems of evil, where they try to say that there is like just a strict incompatibility between God and evil or suffering. I think people should realize that most atheists these days actually think that is not a successful path. There really has been, it seems to me, a movement away from what's called the strong form logical problem of evil, because nobody's ever been able to draw out what exactly the contradiction is, right? So where most atheists have moved, now don't get me wrong, atheists occasionally try to resuscitate the logical problem of evil, but it seems to run into the same problems and quickly evaporates. Where they've tried to move is more towards the evidential problem of evil, and that says, well, look, just kind of given these two controlling paradigms for just comparing theism and atheism, it just seems like the evil and suffering that we encounter, either the types of it, the quantities of it, the frequency of it, the duration of it, whatever, It just seems like this is much better expected if atheism is true rather than theism. So it counts as evidence to some degree, whatever that is. Some atheists are say it's a ton of evidence. Some just say it's moderate evidence. Some atheists are actually not very impressed by it, but they'll still want to claim some evidence for it, for atheism over theism. So they're saying it's not completely decisive. It doesn't rule out theism totally, but it is some weight in the scale, if you will, for the theistic paradigm. So just doing some stage setting here, right, of how if the problem is actually formally articulated and not just coming with loaded assertion of calling God a moral monster or something like that, right? So yeah, I have a lot to say about that. I want to say that suffering and evil, as scandalous as this may seem, is actually far better evidence for the existence of God than away from God for atheism. And I want to come at this from a couple different angles. First off, right? One is kind of a short response, but I think it's one that the atheist does have to contend with, and it's this, right? If it's not immediately clear that evil and God are incompatible, then we have to ask, are there other reasons that does make it immediately clear that God exists? And I think that there are. So I think that there are classic contemporary arguments, metaphysical demonstrations for God's existence, like Aquinas' De Ente, or just general contemporary contingency arguments that show that the sort of class or type of cause being and contingent things logically entails a necessary being. And when we run a conceptual analysis on the necessary being, that logically entails the full suite of the divine attributes. Yeah. So what I'm saying here is reason clearly points to the existence of God. God's existence by reason is clear. It's actual. Reason does not clearly move from evil to the non-existence of God. And what we should do philosophically is we should always privilege what is clear over what is unclear. And we should use what is clear to try and illumine what is unclear. You following me? So if reason shows that God is actual, but evil is actual as well, then they must be compatible. Logic says if two things are actual, they must be compatible, even if I don't know how, right? That's just a paradox. It's not a contradiction. A contradiction is where we see that two things can't fit together. A paradox is just simply saying, I don't know how they fit together, but I know they must fit together because reason tells me they must. Now, I'm not saying that's going to be convincing to any atheist, but it should be the posture that any of us who believe there is a successful argument for God's existence should take, right? And it diffuses the problem of evil and should relocate it from the position of philosophical objection to theological mystery. So that is more of a point of method or order. But let me pause and just get your thoughts on it, and then we can move
those are fantastic. They're great points. So what I did want to ask you, because this does come up very often, I know if anybody can give a great answer to it, it would be you, is people have reached out to me multiple times. They've said, look, we know that Aquinas deals with a lot of these arguments in a fantastic fashion. Is there anyone else in the church around the time of Aquinas, or perhaps even before Aquinas, that perhaps tackles any of these particular objections?
Oh, well, I mean, for arguments for God, Scotus is great. I'm a big fan of Scotus. I think people should read Scotus. I think Scotus, not just on human free will, which will tie into what we're going to talk about in with respect to evil here in a minute, but also God's necessity, God's absolute uniqueness. I think he offers really valuable resources to philosophy of God that actually are not found in Aquinas. But so he would be my other main guy. Yeah, if I were just to pick one.
And I know that my dear friend Father Coppes, who is a Scotus scholar, will like that praise that we're heaping upon the blessed Duns Scotus. I agree with you. What a fantastic figure! What a fantastic pillar! You can find a ton of great information in the great blessed Duns Scotus. You're correct about that.
Yeah. So let's now look at the evidential problem of evil. So there's a couple of ways of assessing this, right? When we're thinking about whether some phenomena counts in favor of some hypothesis, we essentially have to ask, how likely or expected is this experience or this data given some hypothesis, say the existence of God, versus given not that hypothesis, say atheism or naturalism. Now, broadly speaking, naturalism, metaphysical naturalism, is probably the most philosophically common form of atheism, and it essentially is run by a principle of indifference, that whatever else fundamental reality is, it's neither a benevolent nor malignant personal force, right? Just utter indifference at the bottom of naturalism, whereas classical theism says fundamental reality is run by a principle of perfection, right? I think this is like the broadest ways to separate them. You either have perfection at the bottom or you have indifference at the bottom, right? Okay. And with indifference, with naturalism, you usually have physical indifference, right? You often have forms of reductionism. Not all, this is where you got to be careful, not all atheists are sort of hardball physicalists. But I think that's the most promising form, right? And I think if you move away from that, you're inviting complexities that are not good for your philosophical naturalism, right? So, all right, then we have now here's what I like to say. Sorry, this is a lot of stage setting. I promise there'll be some payoff here. In order to think about whether suffering and evil is better expected on theism or atheism, we have to and must think about everything that is entailed by suffering and evil. And what I mean by that is suffering and evil isn't some isolated phenomena. For us to even make judgments about suffering and evil requires that there are conscious beings, right, that have moral knowledge, that demands that there are actual moral facts, right, that there is a contingent universe, that there are complex, highly complicated life forms, all these different things, right? There's conditions that already have to be in place before we can ever get to the judgment that something is evil, right? Or something is bad, or something has gone wrong. Now, if that's right, now some atheists might press back on some of those things like moral knowledge and moral facts, but I could say you could even drop those out and give an error theory and my argument will still work. But I don't think most atheists really want to give those up. Most atheists I talk to anyways, because they realize the consequences are too absurd. Now, when you're asking if some sort of data point called A, what is its evidential impact? You have to consider also its entailments. If A entails B, then the evidential impact of A is A and B, right? This is undoubtedly true. And what I'm saying is this, right? There are certain entailments that come along with our judgment of suffering and evil, like conscious beings, like a contingent universe, that atheism cannot possibly adequately explain. I think atheism, it's not even that it's improbable that there will be contingent being on atheism. It's impossible. It's not even improbable that there will be conscious beings capable of attaining moral knowledge on atheism. It's impossible. Now, if that's the case, then if we've already sort of looked at the evidential impact of those things, atheism is already a probability zero. And that's sticky, which then means the problem of evil is irrelevant because there's barriers on the way to the problem of evil that atheism cannot possibly clear. Let me give an analogy to try and draw this point. Imagine that you heard that somebody won an obstacle course race. This is an analogy that I've been working on a little bit, right? And at the final obstacle, the obstacle course race, somebody has to lift this boulder, this big boulder, and put it up on a pedestal, right? And you're told that there were two competitors, right? There were only two competitors, and somebody won. And one competitor, he looks like me, kind of wiry, not that big, not that muscular. So might look like I would struggle to lift a huge boulder, right? Maybe it's not impossible for me, but it might look like
you're a strong guy, though. I know that.
Well, we'll maybe get to that in a minute, right? And then the other competitor, really stocky, you hear has a totally built upper body, and that's the information you get, right? Well, you might initially think that given that description, that competitor 2 won. But then what if you learn more information? What if you learn that before you get to that final obstacle, there's a whole bunch of other obstacles? For example, there's long jumping obstacles, and there's swimming obstacles, and there's climbing obstacles, and there's balancing obstacles. And then what if you learn that the second competitor has no legs, right? Is blind, right? All these other things. Well, now you would reassess. You would say, okay, even if competitor 1 would struggle to lift that boulder, I know competitor 2 would never even get there. It's impossible for competitor 2 to ever get there. So it has to be the case that competitor 1 lifted that boulder. I want to say that's the first way people should think about the problem of evil. There are entailments when we think about our judgment of evil that atheism cannot in principle explain. Atheism could not even get to the point of trying to explain evil because it's already stuck at all of these prior obstacles that it cannot overcome. Now, I understand that I've just asserted that at this point, but I think that there are demonstrative arguments against naturalism from consciousness, from contingency, and others as well, right? So atheism is stuck there at probability zero. Now, I want to go even further. Let's just be, and at that point, I think the debate is done, but let's be generous and say, okay, maybe it's not impossible that atheism could clear those barriers. Maybe it's not impossible. Maybe it's just really improbable. So it does get to the boulder. And now we have to independently assess what is the evidential impact, because it's not completely out of the explanatory race. What I want to say here is once we start to dive actually deeper into each theory, we'll see that the evil and suffering of our experience is actually better expected if God exists than if atheism is true, which means even just considering the evil and suffering of our experience, and of our experience is important, right?
Yep.
That assessment will turn out to be favorable for theism and unfavorable for atheism, for several reasons. Here's a provocative one, right? I think this is right, but you tell me what you think, William. Atheism is run by a principle of indifference, and if that's the case, it seems like suffering and evil could have kind of landed anywhere, right? It seems like it could have been far worse than it is. It seems like it could have also been far less than it is, right? However, we know that if suffering and evil is to be compatible with God, I want to say it has to fall within a particular range. It has to be in a range that is not absurd, that would be conducive to soul building, that would be conducive to redemption, that would be conducive to the formation of moral communities, that would be conducive to progress of our species as a whole. And look, there's some really bad evils out there, but I don't think anybody wants to deny that that actually is the case, that we do seem to fall within this range that would seem to be the only acceptable range of evil compatible with theism. You see where I'm going with this, right?
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
Whereas if naturalism was true, it seems like we could have so much evil, right, that maybe as soon as conscious beings came online, it was so awful that we all just offed ourselves, right? The species stopped being a going concern. Or we could have so little, perhaps, and I don't think there's any evolutionary reasons to think this couldn't be the case, that maybe there's just the occasional mosquito bite, but there's never any impetus to change, to grow morally, to have compassion, to have empathy, to bind moral communities together, to really progress, or to become saints, right? So there's a certain range of evil that would seem to be conducive for producing saints, and that's a very narrow range, whereas it seems like it could have been anywhere outside of that range if naturalism was true. Theism predicts the narrow range. Naturalism does not. By the fact that we fall within that narrow range, and I would argue we almost certainly do, it's obvious that we do, that has to count as evidence that theism is true and not naturalism, right? So call this the fine-tuning from evil argument. If you're familiar with the fine-tuning from physics argument, there's a sort of parallel there that I'm trying to run with fine-tuning evil. What do you think of that?
I think that's fantastic, really. And I think it really does highlight a number, in my opinion, a number of issues that shows that atheism really, in the end, is not viable at all. Those are really good points that you bring. Let me ask you this, because I don't think that you brought it up earlier. You alluded to it. I don't think you brought it up. Let me ask you, because the audience would be fascinated to know this. Was there one particular argument, or perhaps knowing you was probably multiple, that really got you moving towards realizing that the worldview of even the best that atheism has to offer is not a viable one? Was there something that really just struck you? Because this you just laid out is fantastic, and I've heard it before, but I've never heard it laid out in such how can I say? I think that you are able to not only please perhaps the person listening that is interested in very deep, meaty information, but even the everyday normal person. I think you've struck that fine balance that you're able to speak, and you're so clear that you're able to break it down in a very simple to understand fashion. I've got to really commend you there. That's really a fine balance that not everybody does have, brother. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. So remind me to come back to the free will thing also in a minute. But let me take your question about the argument. Yeah, I mean, the argument, it was cumulative and gradual, like most position changes are for anybody.
Sure.
But the general class of cosmological contingency type of arguments seemed absolutely, ultimately inescapable to me. It seems to me that for us to even affirm ourselves as rational beings capable of knowing and reasoning, that we're sort of bound up with a principle of sufficient reason, right? I think if we deny that, and the principle of sufficient reason says that everything that exists has an adequate explanation for its existence or characteristics or both, right? Either from the principles of its own nature or an extrinsic cause, right? Mm-hmm. I think if you deny the principle of sufficient reason, you are stuck in irremediable catastrophic and ultimately self-defeating skepticism. I think you just kill all reason in general, which an atheist isn't going to want to do, right? Atheists want to hold on to reason, believe me, right? You don't want to become a radical skeptic just to get out of and to me, like, if somebody has to embrace radical skepticism to avoid the conclusion that God exists, that tells me there's a perverse motivation going on there, right? So yeah, once you had the PSR, right, this explanatory principle, you just smush all the contingent facts together, all the contingent concrete things, and to secure the PSR and to avoid vicious circularity, whatever explains the sort of that there's anything of the type contingent at all cannot be contingent. It has to be necessary. And like I said before, at that point, once you run a conceptual analysis of a necessary being, which Scotus does brilliantly, you'll find that it's possessed of all the divine attributes. Its essence has to be identical to its existence. Because it's necessary, it's not multipliable. It has to be utterly unique. It's going to be purely actual, which is going to entail omnipotence, omniscience, all those sorts of things, right? So yeah, that style of argument, especially from philosophers like Aquinas and Scotus, I think they give the most persuasive and followers of them versions of that type of argument had the most force on me personally. Still does. I've only actually come to appreciate it more and more as I've studied it and tried to give my own formulations over the years. And then circling back to the problem of evil, I just want to say a few more things to motivate why we would actually expect the suffering and evil of our experience on classical theism, just to motivate why I think that prediction is there. And I think this is where good background philosophy, good philosophy of God helps. So for a classical theist, we have to remember that God is identical to his existence. Existence is convertible with goodness. There's this convertibility principle between being and goodness. So God actually just is a subsistent good itself, right? Now, this is important because there's only ultimately one being, and could only be one being, that is a truly necessary being, that is a purely actual being, which is God, whose essence just is subsistent goodness itself. Which, if that's right, then any being that God creates, right, is always going to be an act potency composite. It's always going to be existentially frail. It's always going to be something that isn't perfect and that could fail. Now, if we think that God, as classical theists do, is sort of motivated by a gratuitous loving impulse to share his goodness and bring other beings into the world for the sake of ultimately those beings attaining a loving relationship with him, which is certainly the Catholic paradigm. Well, that entails that God has to bring beings about that have intellect and will, that have free will. You can't have love unless you have the uniting of two free wills. Now, here's I think an important consideration. Only God's will is impeccable because only God is identical to the very moral standard itself. God is goodness itself. We participate in it, right? We always have to look beyond ourselves for the moral rule and the moral standard. And because we're frail, because we can only consider things in a finite way at any given time, we don't know everything about everything all at once in a perfect intuitive vision like God does. We can always choose to consider the moral rule in any particular situation or choose not to and make a moral miscalculation. We can engage in voluntary ignorance, as Boethius described it. We can sin, right? Now, could God confer such special graces that we always consider the right moral rule in every situation? Yes. And we think that for one very special Blessed Lady, that's exactly what he did, right? However, God is not just a perfect creator. He is a perfectly wise governor. He guides things according to their nature in the general run. There are exceptions, and we know there are exceptions because there are miracles, right? But God wouldn't just run miracles all the time because that makes nonsense of having natures in the first place. And God is not in the business of nonsense. So I think it's a good metaphysical principle that at least in the general run, we're not going to see miracles and exceptions to natural operations in the great majority of times. That would be incompatible with God, right? So that means in the general run, God's going to guide us to our end in accord with our nature, which includes a fallible liberty. We are meant to attain our terminal freedom, perfect beatific vision, through our fallible liberty, freedom of choice. God guides us in that way appropriately. And part of the way that God does that is by setting the material conditions that can help form us into saints, right? And that's where suffering, as we all know, actually can be extremely medicinal. And we know in our experience that some of the greatest saints have been forged, the most heroic stories, in the worst of situations and the worst of evil. So what we know from experience is that the human soul is capable of not just overcoming, but completely defeating even the worst evils that this world has ever thrown at it. Now, of course, that doesn't seem to be the case for everybody, but the most we know is that some people at the end of this life just haven't defeated the evils. That doesn't mean they've never defeated them, right? But we know in this life that many people have defeated even the worst evils and become saints. Again, reason using what is clear and sticking with what is clear to drive to your conclusion, not what is unclear. So I want to say, yeah, this is exactly the type of world when you do the substantial philosophical analysis, philosophy of God, philosophy of the human person, philosophical anthropology, that we would expect if classical theism is true. I'm not denying the reality of evil. Evil is evil. Nobody's saying that it's a good thing. It's evil, right? And I'm not denying that there are horrendous amounts of suffering in this world. But I am saying that things could have been wildly different. And there is a particular range that we fall into that is a range predicted by the fundamental perfect reality that is not predicted by a fundamentally indifferent reality. And the fact that we fall in that range, and I think can give very good arguments that we are in that range, means that the suffering and evil of our experience is evidence for theism rather than away. So that's the summary of my view. Yeah.
And that's a great summary. Let me ask you this, your opinion, your thoughts. You laid out a fantastic way to deal with the reality of evil, of suffering. Love the injection there of Holy Mother Mary, and really just emphasizing the free will. Now, do you think that the very fact that you're Catholic and you're able to tackle this with the greatest of saints behind you, as the book of Hebrews says, we're surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. Do you think that gives us an advantage when dealing with these particular issues within, or these particular objections atheists toss at us? Because we realize that within Reformed Protestantism, for instance, the Calvinists do not believe in free will.
Right.
It would be a bit of an issue for them, in my opinion, to tackle this head on. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The only coherent account of a libertarian free will, and I affirm libertarianism, that I've ever seen is in the Thomistic tradition. And you have to make it coherent, not just internally, that the notion of libertarian free will is coherent. Like, how does it work? And it works by considering finite beings in the space of reasons, and we can get into that if you want. But also, even more fundamentally, is how is it compatible with God's universal causality? And Thomas gives us that. I think Calvinists go too far. They think that it isn't compatible with the divine universal causality. And I think that they just ignore the great resources that the Thomistic tradition has to offer for that. And I would commend two thinkers in the Thomistic tradition who I think show that this is perfectly compatible. I'll give three. I'll give a bonus here. Three people in the Thomistic tradition that can show you can have a robust libertarian freedom with divine universal causality. One is Mortimer Adler. He's got tremendous works. Just check out his Idea of Freedom. It's a really big volume. A shorter one, but somebody who is a brilliant philosopher in his own right and should be studied in many areas, but is incredible on freedom of choice, is Yves Simon. And his little book, Freedom of Choice, will articulate how to think about libertarian freedom in relation to principles of causality, the principles of sufficient reason, and divine universal causality. I think that should really give Calvinism a strong reason to reconsider, because they're worried about divine sovereignty, right? Like, I understand their worry, right? Because what you don't want is something like swimming totally outside the pool of the divine universal causality. That would be incoherent, right? So I agree with the Calvinists there, but the problem is they fail to understand appropriately just how transcendent of a cause God really is, right? That God's causality is not competitive with creaturely causality. So having these different distinctions of the orders of causality is really helpful. Bernard Lonergan, I won't recommend him because he's really dense on this unless you're like really want to go expert level. But Matthews Grant, he's got a great book actually just called something like God's Universal Causality and Human Freedom. Can't recommend that enough. So short answer is, yeah, I think it's only really within the Catholic tradition that you find the resources to deal with these thorny issues. And also outside of it started in the Catholic tradition, but it's become more popular outside, or other, I think, false starts like Molinism and stuff like that, that ultimately Molinism at the end of the day, I think is committed to a number of issues of trying to secure human freedom. One is that there's a such thing as counterfactuals, of creaturely freedom. That's the idea that like God knows what you would do in any situation if he put you there. I think that's false. I think the whole notion, there's no fact about what you would do until you do it, right? There's nothing even for God to know in that situation. It also does seem to put something, again, outside of God's universal causality. So I think what you need is a very subtle middle position, which I think only really the Thomistic and Scotistic traditions give you there to navigate that difficult terrain. Mm-hmm.
You bring up the great Blessed Duns Scotus. One particular question comes up very often when talking about Holy Mary, and you'll hear it from people within Catholicism as well. And I can't think of a better person to perhaps give us a logical, cogent kind of breakdown of it, would be the issue of Holy Mary and free will. Now, we believe within, I want to be clear, not only within Catholicism, any apostolic faith believes Mary to be sinless. So I'm not getting into the topic of the Immaculate Conception. We're talking about the sinlessness of Mary, the personal sinlessness. Mm-hmm. That being said, we believe Mary had free will. And people within Protestantism or even atheists will bring up the objection and say, well, if Mary would have had free will, how could she have had free will? And was she ever tempted? Was her free will different? It does bring up the question of, was she ever tempted to sin? Did she actually have that free will? Was that free will taken away from her? Was she kind of, the objection that a Calvinist brought up about a month ago was that you guys have made Mary out to be robotic. If she had no sin at all, that means that she could not have had any free will. How would we answer that in a logical way as a Catholic?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, part of it's going to come down to what your notion of libertarian free will is, and there's debate about this in the literature. Some would say to have free will, there has to be a sort of principle of alternative possibilities. Call that the PAP, right? You got to have the PAP. Right. I don't think any Christian should accept that. Certainly Aquinas didn't accept it, because then you're going to have difficulties with free will in heaven, right? We do not want to accept that because you can't turn away from God that you don't have free will. So this isn't a problem just for the Blessed Mother, right? Or Catholics, right? If you're a Christian committed to traditional understandings of heaven, that you're sort of locked on to the good, but freely, right? Then you better think about this deeply, right? So we should reject that. Rather, what we should say is that your action is free when it is substantially generated by you, right? That's it. And the notion here again comes back to a couple different notions, right? So the idea is that God as a supreme good, once we come face to face with God, we will just always freely choose God, right? Because that is what our nature is directed to. So we're not coerced into doing it, right? Because the action is still voluntary from us, even though we would never choose anything alternative to that. And we don't need the principle of alternative possibilities, right? It's a action that comes from the substance and is engaged voluntarily, right? That to me is sort of what you want to say for libertarian free will. And then you just simply also need to affirm that that is compatible with certain graces. And I think you have all the resources there to say that Mary was perfectly free as well. But then you do need to give a story of why those graces weren't given to every human being. And I tried to give that a little bit earlier about how God naturally works with us according to our fallible liberty. That is, of course, extremely befitting. And then you can give further stories about the fittingness of giving Mary special graces, the effects of the fall, and bring in all the other theological resources. So those are at least the seeds of how I think people should begin to think about that type of stuff, right? But it is important to think about heaven, the beatific vision, and to reject, I think, certain false notions of free will. A lot of people come in with this idea that if you don't have alternative possibilities, you aren't free. I think that's false for many independent reasons, but certainly no Christian should accept that. I think it's incompatible with the theory of heaven and afterlife.
Yeah, what a great answer there. And I think it's important to have it on record, because people have pondered it and asked the question before, and they believe it to be a difficult one. I don't think it is a difficult one. I think it can be a problematic one if you don't fully understand exactly what is being said about Holy Mary and what is being said about free will. But I think you broke that down in a fantastic way. Let me ask you this. Your opinion, and I know you probably have many. If you could dialogue with an atheist that, or rather, let me rewind that, an agnostic, open to theism, open to the possibility that there is a God, there's a supreme being, which, by the way, your description of this supreme being is fantastic. And I think the way you laid it out is necessary to fully grasp and understand what we are saying about the doctrine of the Trinity. But a whole discussion for a whole other day. I want to say that you're very, very clear. You're very crystal clear in that, and I want to commend you, brother. I think that you've been doing a fantastic job. This is very clearly an area.
Thank you.
I don't think you're good at. I think you are elite level. Fantastic. Let me ask you this. You've got somebody agnostic, open to theism, and they just throw it right at you, Pat. Give me your best argument for the existence of God, or best arguments. Do you think that there are certain, there's a, maybe a tier or tiers of arguments that you think, these are just knockout arguments that will really compel somebody to be moved towards theism?
Yeah, I think this is where it's helpful to actually have a sort of battery of different arguments that you can at least give a sketch of, because let's be perfectly honest, right? We've barely given a sketch of some of the arguments here, and to really understand a cosmological argument is it's like a 10-year project, right? Frankly, it is, right? If you really want to be an expert on it. So it's just not well suited to like a bus ride conversation, right? Of like trying to unload Aquinas's metaphysics of essence and essay and the real distinction. I mean, probably not the best, just practically, apologetically speaking, right? So what I like to say, William, is I just like to say, hey, look, first I say I used to be a naturalist. There was a whole bunch of problems that I think came out of that paradigm, and now I've come to realize that God is the best and simplest explanation for all of human experience, for why anything exists at all, especially why any contingent being, for why there are conscious beings, for why there is rationality, for why there is libertarian human free will, for why there are moral facts, for why there is moral knowledge of how we can even link up to the moral facts, right? For why there are near-death experiences, for why there are mystical experiences, religious experiences. And of course, I would argue God is the best and simplest explanation of the historical data surrounding the life, death, resurrection of Christ. I'll go even further. The endurance of the Catholic Church would be extremely surprising if God didn't exist and Catholicism wasn't true. But here it is. Marian apparitions, Eucharistic miracles. There's an enormous range of data and experiences that makes perfect sense if God exists. It's just the type of stuff we would expect. Makes no sense if God doesn't exist. And the fact that that's exactly what we encounter should cause us to be extremely confident in a classical theistic worldview, and I would even say a Catholic paradigm.
I totally agree. I think that the incredible pedigree that we have within the Catholic faith is enough to really compel anyone to look. If we have this amount of evidence for the bodily resurrection, Eucharistic miracles, Marian apparitions, and what have you, that it means what Jesus of Nazareth said was definitely true, and he did establish a church built upon that rock, the vicar of Christ and successors. And as we know, that is throughout history clearly laid out in Scripture as well. Another thing that will get brought up, and I'm very curious how you would answer this, is what if we were to encounter because I do a lot of work with Eastern Christians as well.
Sure.
Debated Eastern Orthodox, very good friends of mine, great people, nice people, and we recognize them as having a valid priesthood, an apostolic church. Well, what if a priest would come up to you, Pat, and they'll say, look, love everything that you've said. I prefer Palimism when dealing with philosophy, dealing with the way we believe in, as you know, the divine essence and energies theology. They'll ask you, Pat, is that acceptable? Are they compatible? Or would you completely say, look, they're not compatible. I have issues with this, or I have issues with that. How could we answer our Eastern brothers and sisters?
So I'll offer just a friendly response here is I have seen different ways of the essence energies distinction articulated, and some of them certainly seem incompatible with not just Catholicism but good philosophy of God. I mean, I think if you make God composite at all, you're not talking about God. You're talking about something that has a cause part that is in some sense contingent and is not the fundamental explanation. There can be nothing back of God, right? If God is anything, God is where the metaphysical buck stops. Compositeness is always something that's pointing out to an extrinsic composer, at least in the order of real being, right? We can talk about like intentional being and stuff like that later, or some other conversation, right? So I think if you're putting any sort of real composition in God with your Palinism, the answer is no. If you've got a model out there where that isn't the case, I'm certainly open to thinking about it. And I can't say I've ruled all of them out because I haven't examined all of them, but I've had people tell me that they think that there are ways of thinking about it that are compatible with Catholicism and Thomism. I just have to admit it's not something I've studied in any extensive respect, right? Mm-hmm.
But definitely something that you are open to being possibly reconcilable.
Yeah, certainly. Like I said, I don't want to reject anything unless I fully understand it. Right. So if there's a model out, like I'm fully committed to divine simplicity. I think it's simplicity or bust for ultimate intelligibility and explanation. Otherwise, you're sort of stuck with brute facts, and then the atheists, now they've got you on something, right? Either reality is completely intelligible, which means that fundamental reality must be absolutely ontologically simple, right? Because that's the only sort of thing that could be a sort of self-explanatory fact. And what I want to say is, unless something is self-explanatory, nothing is ultimately explained, right? So we have to make this category shift for deep metaphysical reasons. That reason tells me is very clear and is a non-negotiable. If you've got certain ways of thinking about other theological commitments that are compatible with that, of course I'm open to hearing about those models. But I would just encourage people to really understand why the commitment of divine simplicity is there, which many people don't, and what the theoretical costs of that denial are, which to my mind are should be absolutely unacceptable to any theist. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic point. Let me ask you this, because this did come up in a dialogue that I had with an atheist scholar, and I want to be very fair. The atheist scholar was not trying to be combative at all. He was being legitimately genuine. He told me privately, he said, William, I confronted I spoke with a priest about this. I even spoke with a Catholic theologian whom I will not name. And he said they really couldn't give me a good answer. And you know, I'm not opposed. He said, I do not believe in the Eucharistic presence of Christ. I don't believe in it, but I am open to there being a logical way for a Catholic to answer me. And he said this, he said, you Catholics love to talk about Eucharistic miracles. And then he said, but wouldn't it violate the very principles of transubstantiation if we're talking about a miracle where we physically see a hunk of flesh appear or what have you? And he said, William, doesn't Trent and don't these other councils say that you don't physically see Christ appear there after the words of consecration? And then he asked, would that violate transubstantiation when a Eucharistic miracle does occur? Brother, if you could just perhaps give your thoughts on that, because I know if anyone can knock it out of the park with that.
Yeah, I mean, getting a little bit out of my wheelhouse here. I know you on transubstantiation are far more studied than me, but metaphysically, transubstantiation means across substance, right? So what we believe is there's a fundamental substantial change, but the accidents, right, how it appears to us remain the same, right? And why do Catholics believe this? Well, we believe it because it's been revealed. I think it also makes a lot of sense. Again, some things I haven't mentioned that are worth mentioning is, again, if you have this principle that God works with things according to their nature, a lot of Catholicism makes sense. So let me just build this out real quickly, because I think it will help to answer your question, right? We are creatures that are physical, for one thing. We also, so we have physical senses, right? In case that's a surprise to anyone. But we also are creatures that depend on institution, to depend on authority for a lot of our epistemology, for a lot of our knowledge, for a lot of getting around in the world. So it seems like if God is going to reveal something and something is really essential, that you don't want it to completely go off the rails, and just given human nature, this something will have to be transmitted through tradition and institution, because that's how humans naturally organize. That is our nature. Then you might think that God would want to put in some sort of safeguard to make sure that that transmission is effective. Otherwise, revelation is kind of, I don't know. God isn't in the business of doing pointless things. And that sets you up really strongly with something like an infallible magisterium, an expectation. Like, this is the sort of thing I would actually expect, given human nature, good philosophy of God, and the assumption that God would want to reveal something, which I think is also an assumption that can be philosophically motivated, right? Then, given that God works with creatures according to what they are, we're physical beings, so something like the sacraments begins to make a lot of sense, right? There's such a physical reality to it. It's really, really a beautiful befittingness to it.
Yeah.
A lot of what moved me towards Catholicism, William, were these sort of philosophical befittingness arguments, not just strict logical demonstrations, but saying, hey, if you've got this background philosophy, something like this just fits really nice. It's really fitting.
Oh, yeah.
Aquinas makes those types of arguments. Well, Eucharistic miracles, I think, are also fitting because given that we are physical creatures and we do take it as revealed and on the authority of Christ, we like confirmatory signs, as they're called, right? We like sort of winks from God that confirm that what we're believing is authentic, right? And I think this is exactly what we see through the history of Catholicism, especially through things like Eucharistic miracles and Marian apparitions. So I want to say confirmatory signs are the sort of thing God would give to us to make it so there's always enough evidence there for those who are willing to believe, right? It's, of course, it's quite possible for people to ignore that evidence and look away from it as well. It's not something that you can't force anybody to believe anything. The human intellect and will is an amazing power, right? People can always shut their eyes to something, right? Always. So I don't think that there's anything that is like people doubt that the external world is real and stuff like that, right? Like people can believe anything, right? Now, does it violate transubstantiation? I don't see how. To me, it's just sort of an additional layer of miracle. Maybe I'm not understanding the objection.
You got it perfectly. Mm-hmm. You nailed it perfectly. Every now and then, I had never ever heard it laid out there that every now and then, God wants to, basically wink at us and say, hey, I'm right here. It doesn't violate it at all because it's a miracle. We don't expect it to occur before our very eyes every time we go to Holy Mass. But brother, you laid it down perfectly. You're definitely right about that. And I've got to say that everything you laid out is so masterful in the fact that you're right. You would expect these things in a living magisterium in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. I think all those are really good points you bring up. Indeed, for me, I've got to be very honest, and I'll take a cue from a mutual friend of ours, a very good friend of mine, Gary Machuda, who he brought up a really good point. I remember I was dialoguing with him a few years back, and he says, outside of Catholicism, nothing else really does make sense.
It really doesn't.
It really doesn't.
I'm not trying to be like overly polemical, but to me, just sorry to interject here.
No,
but like the best alternative I found was like a sort of broad religious pluralism. Like I said before, that's kind of where I was at. I think actually C.S. Lewis said something like that too. He's like, it's either Christianity or Hinduism or something like that, right? And like I still think that's kind of right, but ultimately, that didn't quite do it for me.
No,
but the Catholic paradigm did. Sorry, continue your thought though. Yeah.
No, you're right. I mean, the way that I look at it, Pat, and this goes right into Gary's wheelhouse of dealing with the canon of Scripture. If you're not Catholic, you run into a humongous problem because even if, and I'm going to pretend this is a Bible. I don't have a Bible with me on transubstantiation. Pretend it's the Bible. Even if you've got a Protestant Bible lacking 7 books, the very fact that you can come up to a Protestant and ask him, how can you be sure Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John belong in your Bible and not the Gospel of Thomas and not the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or what have you? At the end of the day, it comes down to authority. And really, there's no way that they can really truly know that this really is the Word of God that they can trust and that there are not other books that belong in there.
Yeah.
They run into a massive problem there. The canon is a huge problem, but as Catholics, we know that we can solve that particular issue, whereas it's a bit of a major problem for them.
And I think it's bad. So, a lot of my way of thinking about this is colored through philosophy because that's the background I come from. I'm not a theologian. I hope I haven't even pretended to be in this conversation, right? But to me, that just seems like bad philosophical anthropology. And a lot of Protestantism, you seem to have a sort of radical individualism, but that's just not how the human person is set up. We're meant to flourish and thrive and learn and grow in community through tradition and via institution. You see what I mean? Right. Yeah. So we would expect that to be sort of essentially bound up, I think, with whatever the true religion is. So aside from I think the deeply problematic epistemological issues of things like sola scriptura and whatnot. I just think that it's just bad philosophical anthropology, right? Humans are not that radically individualistic. God isn't going to work with things in a way that is incongruent with their nature.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt. As we come up to the hour mark, I do want to wrap it up at the hour mark, and then I'd love to have another discussion with you. Really, pretty much
anytime. Yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, you've been incredible, brother. You've been amazing. But before we wrap it up at the 1 hour mark, I want to give you time to put a plug in for anything you want to point the audience to, a web page, website, blog, anything, brother. The floor is yours right now. And I want to tell you, first off, you've been magnificent, and I've greatly appreciated our time.
You're too kind, William. Well, it's you're so easy to talk to, and I always love chatting with you. And I guess the thing I'll plug is my channel, Philosophy for the People, over on YouTube. If people like your content, they'll probably dig that, and they'll probably especially dig the series that we did. You were on my channel not too long ago.
I'll be back soon.
Yep, responding to different objections, Protestant objections to Catholicism. I think we actually did talk transubstantiation a bit as well. So they'll find a friendly face over there, you. So yeah, Philosophy for the People on YouTube, and then on iTunes, it's the humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show, and that's a generalist podcast. There's lots of different content on there, but you'll get the occasional philosophy and Catholic themed episode as well. So those would be the two places to go to. Mm-hmm.
Will they, whenever your book is ready to come out, will they be able to find information about it over there so they can go ahead and purchase it?
I hope so. I hope I don't forget to mention it when it comes out. But also, the first one with Aquinas. Aquinas is Little Known Way to God. That's in the hands of Catholic Answers right now in the editing. So I have no idea what the timeline is for that, but I'm sure that you'll hear about it. And then the other one with Sophia, I owe them my first draft by the end of summer, which I hope will happen. And then what's the timeline after that? Unfortunately, I just don't know. Well, hopefully next year. Hopefully early next year is what I'm hoping for.
I tell you one thing, I will be praying for you for everything you're doing.
Please, yeah, thank
the
you.
Audience will be praying for you as well, brother. You're doing fantastic work. What a great blessing you truly are to the church. And brother, I look forward to having you back on again. We will talk again soon.
God bless you. Thank you so much.
God bless you, brother. Thank you.